The atmosphere descending from the jagged granite spires of the Colorado Rockies was sharp with the crystalline scent of impending snow long before the heavens took on their leaden, bruised hue. It was the tail end of 1886, and that biting aroma clung to Jonah Crow like a persistent ghost as he navigated his way into the raucous, soot-stained mining settlement of Silverton. He was mounted on a bay gelding that mirrored its master's exhaustion. An animal composed primarily of protruding bone and an iron-willed stubbornness. Jonah himself was a lean silhouette of a man, whittled down by months of solitary labor on a remote trap line. His buckskin jacket was a map of his recent history, darkened by the sticky resin of pine pitch and the deep, copper stains of elk blood. His eyes, the shade of cold flint, were never still. They darted with a predatory caution, constantly scanning his surroundings like a man who lived in perpetual expectation of an ambush. Jonah had a deep-seated aversion to civilization. He despised the cacophony of the streets, the intrusive gazes of strangers, and the condescending sneers of gentlemen in polished coats who skirted around him as if his very presence were a contagion. Yet, even a man who finds solace in the void must eventually break his silence. Survival required more than what the wilderness provided. He needed dry goods, powder, and lead. But beneath those immediate needs lay a deeper, more profound hunger, a craving for a permanent anchor. He was weary of being a nomad, drifting through the high passes like aimless wood smoke. He desired a threshold he could cross, a door he could bolt from the inside, and a patch of earth he could call his own with absolute certainty. He found himself drawn toward the local courthouse, a building where the air was thick with the musk of decaying parchment and the stale, lingering haze of cheap cigars. Inside, a listless clerk droned through a ledger of properties that had been repossessed by the territory. A small congregation of weathered cattlemen and opportunistic land speculators shifted their weight, their boots scuffing the floorboards in a rhythm of boredom. The clerk eventually reached Lot 42. It was a modest cabin and a mining claim situated on the formidable heights of Black Pine Ridge, seized due to a failure to pay back taxes. A ripple of mocking laughter rolled through the chamber. Black Pine Ridge was notorious, a brutal, unforgiving stretch of vertical geography that remained entombed in snow for half the year. Every spring, the melt-off obliterated the access trails, leaving the summit isolated. Furthermore, the property bore the dark stain of a local legend. The town spoke in whispers of a curse. The previous inhabitant, an aging trapper, had supposedly perished there in the throes of a violent madness. When the clerk called for an opening bid, he was met with a heavy, mocking silence. One onlooker leaned over to discharge a stream of tobacco juice into a brass cuspidor, muttering that the gales up on that ridge wailed with the voice of a banshee. Another skeptic remarked that the heavy mountain snows had undoubtedly crushed the roof into the floorboards long ago. The clerk gave a weary sigh, already reaching for the next file to dismiss the lot. $1, Jonah's voice cut through the room. The atmosphere turned brittle. Necks craned and bodies shifted as heads turned toward the gloom at the rear of the hall. Jonah emerged from the shadows, the jagged scar along his jawline catching the amber light filtering through the high, dusty windows. He offered no grin of triumph and felt no need to justify his madness. With a steady hand, he placed a single silver dollar on the clerk's desk. The gavel fell with the sharp, final report of a pistol shot. "Sold," the clerk announced, shaking his head. He looked Jonah in the eye and remarked that the stranger hadn't purchased a home, but rather a pre-dug grave. Jonah meticulously folded the deed, tucking it into the inner pocket of his coat. He thought to himself that if it were to be his grave, at least it would be a piece of ground he owned. By the time the afternoon began to fade, he was already ascending the steep switchbacks toward the ridge, the first flakes of snow hissing as they struck his weathered face. As he climbed, the timber became gnarled and ancient, twisted by the unrelenting pressure of the altitude. The world grew hushed, the air gaining a heavy, oppressive quality. By the time he crested the final rise and entered the clearing where his new acquisition stood, the sky was a violent palette of bruised violets and dying oranges behind the jagged peaks. The cabin looked like a skeletal relic of a forgotten era. It featured a sagging porch, logs scarred by decades of frost, and crude tin patches hammered into the roof to ward off the elements. It was a rugged, broken thing, but it was his. He secured his horse and moved toward the entrance, his mind already cataloging the necessary repairs. Suddenly, he froze. A delicate, ethereal ribbon of smoke was spiraling from the stone chimney. His hand instinctively dropped to the hilt of the heavy knife at his belt. The legal document in his pocket claimed the site was abandoned. The rising smoke told a different story. Small, fresh boot prints were visible in the light dusting of snow near the porch. Moving with the silence of a mountain cat, Jonah stepped onto the porch and pressed his ear to the wood. Inside, he heard the faint, rhythmic scrape of metal against iron, the sound of someone stoking a stove. He lifted the latch and swung the door wide. The interior was swathed in shadow, illuminated only by the flickering orange pulse of the hearth and the dim glow of a kerosene lamp. The room was heavy with the scent of burning pine and palpable terror. In the far corner stood a woman. She was gaunt, dressed in a faded wool garment that had been mended until the original fabric was nearly lost. Her dark hair was plaited over one shoulder. Though her hands were trembling with exhaustion or fear, the Winchester rifle she leveled at Jonah's chest was steady. "Leave this place," she commanded. Her voice was flat and devoid of emotion, the voice of someone who had learned through bitter experience that screaming was a waste of breath. Jonah raised his hands slowly, palms open. "This cabin is mine," he stated calmly. "I purchased it in town just hours ago." "You're a liar," she countered, her finger tensing on the trigger. "I paid $1 for the deed," Jonah replied. Outside, a sudden gust of wind slammed against the timber walls, and sleet rattled against the single-pane window. In the dim light, Jonah noticed the dark discolorations around her wrists and the way she shifted her weight carefully, as if protecting cracked ribs. The hollows beneath her cheekbones spoke of a long-term acquaintance with hunger. "I'm staying," he said, his tone unwavering. "A blizzard is descending. I've brought supplies. I won't have your death on my conscience by casting you into the cold." Her gaze flickered momentarily toward the heavy sack of flour sitting on the porch. A flash of desperate hunger crossed her features before she masked it with a stony glare. "Place your blade on the table," she ordered. Jonah hesitated. A man in the high country did not part with his steel easily. But noticing the slight tremor in her grip, he unbuckled his sheath and placed it on the scarred wood. She tilted the rifle barrel away from his heart, though she did not lower the weapon. "What do they call you?" he asked. "Millie," she replied after a long silence. "Millie Leroux." "I'm Jonah Crow." They moved around the cramped space with the caution of wary animals as he hauled in his gear and barred the door against the escalating gale. As night fell, absolute and cold, Jonah rolled out his blankets near the drafty threshold, keeping a respectful distance. Millie remained perched on the edge of a narrow cot, the rifle resting across her lap, watching him as if he might either vanish into the air or strike without warning. Hours crawled by. The storm outside intensified, howling like a predatory beast. Then, beneath the roar of the wind, Jonah caught a different sound, the rhythmic crunch of multiple sets of boots breaking through the crust of the snow. He sat bolt upright. Millie was already on her feet, her face ashen in the lamplight. "They've found me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They've come to take me back." Jonah didn't ask for a history lesson. He didn't ask what sins or circumstances had brought her here. "Extinguish the light," he commanded. The cabin plunged into darkness. He muffled the glow of the stove and pulled Millie down into the shadows behind the heavy timber table. Outside, muffled shouts rose above the wind. One voice argued that the place was empty, while another insisted he had seen the telltale sign of smoke. The latch rattled violently. Jonah drew his revolver, the hammer clicking back with a lethal precision. "It's barred," a voice grumbled from the porch. "Probably seized up with rust." After an agonizing silence, the footsteps receded into the whiteout. Jonah waited until the only sound remaining was the shriek of the storm. When he finally relit the lamp, Millie was still huddled on the floor, shaking. "I was promised you would arrive," she whispered. Jonah's brow furrowed. "By whom?" "Etienne," she said. "The old man who lived in this cabin. He told me to stay put. He said a man stubborn enough to buy this godforsaken ridge would be the only thing standing between me and the town." Jonah surveyed the decaying walls and the woman who was being hunted like an animal. He realized then that his silver dollar hadn't just bought him a roof, it had bought him a front-row seat to a private war. The blizzard showed no mercy that night. It battered the cabin like a living entity trying to claw its way through the chinking. Snow drifted high against the entrance, and the wind moaned through the gaps in the logs. Jonah never left his post by the door. He sat with his sidearm resting on his thigh, his flinty eyes fixed on the dark window. Millie hadn't returned to the bed. She stayed near the table, wrapped in a coarse blanket Jonah had offered her. "They won't give up," she said into the darkness. "Who are they?" Jonah asked. "Sheriff Boone and his hired hands," she explained, her voice tight. "But they aren't looking for a criminal. They're looking for the ground beneath our feet." Jonah looked at her. The name Boone carried weight. The man was a local titan who controlled Silverton with an iron grip. "Etienne Leroux was my uncle," Millie continued. "The stories about a curse are lies spread by Boone. There's a rich silver vein running right through this ridge. My uncle found it first, and Boone killed him for it by letting him rot up here in the cold. They wanted the deed, but Etienne hid it. He told me to come here and wait for a mountain man who was as hard as the stone itself." She looked at him with an intensity that made Jonah's chest tighten. He wasn't a man who believed in fate or ghosts, but he understood the nature of men like Boone. "Do you have the paper?" Millie nodded. She reached beneath a loose floorboard near the hearth and retrieved a packet wrapped in oilskin. Jonah opened it. It was a legitimate, stamped claim deed. Proof of immense wealth. Boone wasn't just chasing a girl, he was chasing an empire. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from outside, the sound of wood splintering under pressure. Jonah stood instantly. The men hadn't left, they had merely circled back. "They'll burn us out," Millie whispered. Jonah grabbed his coat and moved toward the door. "You can't take them all on," she warned. "I don't have to," he replied. He stepped out into the teeth of the storm. The wind felt like 1,000 knives, and the snow blinded him instantly. But Jonah knew how to read the bones of the earth. He didn't stay near the cabin, he circled wide through the timber, moving with a ghost-like silence despite the deep drifts. Through the swirling white, he spotted 3 figures near the edge of the clearing. One held a shielded lantern, another carried a canister of kerosene. Jonah didn't announce himself. He didn't offer a warning. He fired a single shot. The lantern shattered, plunging the attackers into absolute darkness. In the ensuing chaos, men cursed and stumbled. One lost his footing and tumbled into a ravine. Another fired blindly toward the cabin, his shots disappearing into the trees. Jonah shifted his position before they could spot the muzzle flash. He fired again, the bullet kicking up snow inches from a man's boot. "If you set foot on this ridge again," Jonah bellowed, his voice carrying through the gale like a judgment, "you won't live to see the valley." A heavy silence followed, save for the wind. Then came the sound of retreating footsteps, frantic and uncoordinated. Jonah waited in the cold until the snow began to fill their tracks. When he finally returned to the cabin, Millie was standing by the door, her rifle still raised. When she saw him, the tension in her posture finally snapped. "Are they gone?" she asked. "For the moment." He barred the door and began brushing the frost from his beard. Without thinking, Millie reached out and swept the snow from his shoulders. The sudden intimacy of the gesture caused them both to freeze. "You could have just walked away," she said softly. "You didn't know what you were getting into for $1. "I knew exactly what I was buying," Jonah replied, looking at her. "I bought my own land. And I don't let any man take what's mine." He moved to the stove and fed the fire. The flames roared to life, casting a warm, protective glow over the room. For the first time, Millie lowered her rifle completely. "You aren't afraid of Boone?" she asked. "No," Jonah said. "Are you afraid of me?" Jonah paused, truly looking at her, the resilience in her eyes, the strength it took to survive the winter alone. "I reckon I might be," he said quietly. "Millie, you're the most formidable thing on this mountain." A small, genuine smile touched her lips. As dawn approached, the storm began to lose its teeth. The morning light turned the world into a vast sea of shimmering silver. Jonah stepped out onto the porch and looked down the slope. In the distance, he could see 3 riders. They weren't leaving, they were hovering at the base of the ridge, watching. He knew Boone would return. A man like that wouldn't let silver or pride slip away so easily. He stepped back inside and closed the door. "They'll be back," Millie said. "Let them," Jonah replied, holding up the oilskin packet. "Because this time, they're going to find out we've dug in." The following days were not peaceful, but they were purposeful. Jonah didn't waste a second of daylight. He constructed a barricade of fallen timber near the approach and reinforced the cabin's perimeter. He ensured he had clear lines of sight while the attackers would be exposed. By mid-morning on the 3rd day, the riders began their ascent. They came openly this time. Sheriff Boone led the way, his heavy coat billowing, flanked by 2 deputies with rifles at the ready. Jonah stood on the porch, his rifle held in a relaxed but ready position. Millie watched from the window, her hands steady on the Winchester. Boone halted his horse 30 feet away. "Morning," he called out, his voice booming with a false authority. "You're holding property that belongs to the law." "I bought this land in a public auction," Jonah countered. Boone's smile was thin and cold. "The clerk made a mistake. This claim is under legal dispute, and the woman you're harboring is a thief." Inside, Millie's expression hardened. "What is she supposed to have stolen?" Jonah asked. "Documents. Legal papers that don't belong to her." Jonah stepped off the porch, his boots crunching on the frozen crust. He kept his distance but maintained his ground. "You have any proof of that?" Boone's patience evaporated. "I am the law in this county. That's all the proof you need." The air between them grew heavy. Jonah had spent his life reading the intentions of men. He saw the way Boone's knuckles were white on the reins and how his eyes darted toward the cabin. Boone expected Jonah to break. Instead, Jonah reached into his coat and produced the sealed deed. "This is a legal claim," Jonah said. "Signed by Etienne Leroux and filed according to the code." Leroux was a madman. Boone spat. "Anything he signed is worthless." Millie pushed the door open and stepped out beside Jonah. "He signed it in front of the pastor and 2 witnesses," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "You might have buried the ledger in town, Sheriff, but you can't bury the people who saw it happen." Boone's horse danced nervously as his deputies exchanged uneasy glances. They had come for a quick intimidation, not a standoff with a mountain man and a woman who refused to flinch. "Go back to town," Jonah said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "And leave this ridge for good." "Or what?" Boone challenged. Jonah leveled his rifle, aiming not at Boone, but at the cinch strap of his saddle. "Or you can find out how long it takes to crawl back to Silverton through 4 feet of snow." The deputies looked at the steep, icy slope behind them and then at Jonah's unblinking eyes. They realized Boone's authority ended where the black pine timber began. Boone spat into the snow, his face twisted in a mask of silent rage. "This isn't over," Boone growled. "On this ridge, it is," Jonah replied. Boone wheeled his horse around and began the slow descent, his deputies following in silence. Jonah didn't lower his weapon until they were long gone. Millie turned to him, her shoulders finally dropping from their defensive hunch. "You didn't even have to pull the trigger. The best fights are the ones you win before they start," Jonah said. He looked at the deed in his hand. "You could sell this for a fortune, you know. You could go anywhere." Jonah looked at the cabin, the crooked chimney, the sturdy logs, the smoke rising peacefully into the blue sky. He thought about the years he had spent as a ghost in the mountains, never belonging anywhere. Then he looked at Millie. "I think this place was waiting for both of us," he said. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic drip of melting snow from the eaves. The ridge no longer felt like a place of exile or a cursed peak. It felt like a sanctuary. In the weeks that followed, the thaw truly took hold. Jonah repaired the structure, and Millie began preparing a small plot for a garden. They worked in a shared, comfortable silence. In Silverton, Boone's shadow began to shrink as word of the encounter spread. The witnesses Millie mentioned came forward, and the truth, though slow, began to dismantle Boone's grip on the valley. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the peaks into shards of molten gold, Millie stood on the porch watching Jonah finish the day's work. "Do you ever regret spending that $1?" she asked with a playful glint in her eye. Jonah set down his tools and walked toward her. He looked out over the vast, wild territory that was now theirs. "No," he said softly. "I think I got a lot more than $1's worth." Millie smiled, and this time, the smile reached her eyes, free of the shadows of the past. The wind rolling down from the high granite peaks no longer carried a warning. It sounded, for the first time in Jonah's life, exactly like home.